just moving to Japan now, where they have made revisions to their security in terms of three national security and defense strategies. Beijing, Pyongyang, and Moscow have reacted by calling or saying that Tokyo is provoking regional tension, embracing unbridled militarization, and so on. How does Japan's upgrade compare to the upgrades in the military of China, North Korea, and say Russia over the past decades?
Three countries who have nuclear weapons are complaining about a country that has no nuclear weapons increasing its conventional weapons inventory by a few percentage points over the next 5 years. China, for example, has a budget of $250 billion this past year, investing in their military, including increasing their nuclear inventory from 350 nuclear warheads approximately to over 1,000 in the same time frame that Japan is increasing its conventional defense systems, although some will have strike, but none of them are nuclear capable. So I find it ironic that North Korea, Russia, and China are complaining about Japan's attempt to protect itself while they sit on top of literally thousands of nuclear weapons. So that's a false argument, in my opinion.
And how have the threats of coming from these three countries, how have they increased recently?
The PLA Navy is now currently has more ships than the U.S. Navy. The number of missiles that they have is over several thousand. Their army is massive with at least 2 million soldiers, and their fighter aircraft number almost 2,000. And that's just China. And recently we had North Korea launch several, over a dozen missiles over Japan, obviously making a statement that Japan is vulnerable. And then this August, we had the Chinese military launching missiles over into Japan's economic zone, although it was supposedly an exercise focused on Taiwan. The message was clear, is that Japan, if you interfere in something that we do in Taiwan, you're at risk as well. And then Russia, of course, is busy right now with Ukraine, but they also have some disputes with Japan in the northern part of Japan. So out of all the countries in the world, I think Japan is making the right move, making a commitment to increase its defense.
So, Gimard, how would you characterize the change to Japan's self-defense? Is it, as some media have said, a historic change to Japan's exclusively self-defense policy since the end of World War II? Or is it more about boosting that self-defense and matching the changing environment?
Well, I hate to give you this answer, but actually it's both. It is an epic change for the Japanese. They've invested about 1% of their GDP over the last 60 years. That's been consistent since the early 60s. They've invested about 1%. And what this is a commitment is to double that in the next 5 years, which isn't a radical change, but it's certainly a change. And it's a good change. If they do what they say they're going to do in the next 5 years, that amount will be about $100 billion, which is still significantly less than what the PLA is, what the CCP invests in the PLA currently is at $280 billion. And China's investment is way over 2% of its GDP. And as we all know, China's the second largest economy in the world, and Japan is the third. But Japan has no interest in being an expansionist power, and that's dictated by its constitution. China has no constraints in its endeavors to increase its power It has no constraint. For example, again, going back to nuclear weapons, the U.S. and Russia have an agreement, a treaty that says that they will not increase their nuclear weapons above a certain amount, which is roughly about 1,500 nuclear weapons that are currently armed and ready to launch. Once China gets to over 1,000 at the end of this decade, there's no stopping them. I would argue that Taiwan should carefully look at what they're doing in Japan and consider doing the same. Luckily, Taiwan already has a strike capability with some of its long-range missiles.
I mean, talking about Taiwan's defense, it is, after the 13% increase from 2022 to 2023, it is around 2.4% of GDP. So there was a jump. However, when you do look at the statistics, that's because 2022 was quite low. But it has maintained, between 2 and 3% of GDP spend over the last few years. And many people obviously are saying that, Taiwan in the position that it's in at the moment actually needs to spend even more.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Japan hasn't been spending based on its GDP the same amount as Taiwan has, but this is GDP. So if you look at the actual number, the investment, okay, Taiwan is investing about 20 billion, whereas Japan is investing about 50 billion. I would use the example of Israel. Israel is investing 5% of its GDP on its defense budget. So that's significant. And I would argue that Japan and Taiwan should look at that as a possible plan, because the message to the PRC needs to be, it's going to hurt you a lot if you try to mess with us. And again, Taiwan has no interest in expanding its power. Japan has no interest.
You mentioned that China's, if we're talking about GDP, it's more than 2%. We're talking about actual figure, it's 280 billion US dollars. But then there's the power that comes with the 2 million active forces too, which
Sure.
is significantly more than what Japan has.
So carefully reading the defense documents that were published a few weeks ago that Japan published, I understand that actually they are increasing some of their military numbers, specifically in the cyber realm. We must recall that China can't use all of its military to attack Japan or Taiwan because it has a big border. It borders India, for example. It has to keep forces there. It borders Russia. Even though they're best of pals, they still have to keep military there just in case the Russians have a change of heart. And all around its borders, for example, if you look at Taiwan's military, they have almost 300,000 soldiers, if you include all services, roughly. And those 2 million soldiers are not going to be marching or on boats or on planes coming to Taiwan. They might be able to bring maybe 400, 500,000, maybe, if they can get there. And the defender always has a better position because they are defending their homeland. And so it's not a 1-for-1 match. Oftentimes people use numbers like 1 to 3. So China is going to need to do a lot more than what it's doing now to really take over Taiwan. That's my opinion. A lot of other analysts say, oh no, China's going to wipe Taiwan off the map. And I said, no, you don't understand. It's different when you're defending. Look at Ukraine. Ukraine is able to defend itself because it's fighting for its survival. It's fighting for its families. It's fighting for its friends. It's fighting for its freedom, just like Japan and Taiwan would. So the numbers are not that great I'll give you an example, a quick example. Let's say they have 1,600 missiles. That's the number that's quoted, pointed at Taiwan. The Chinese media, before the exercise that the PLA conducted, said there was going to be 16 missiles launched. Well, only 11 were launched, or 11 actually made where they were supposed to go. No one knows what happened to those other 5. So if 5 don't work out of 16, that's a pretty high percentage. It's almost a third. Then you also look at the fact that the missiles might not hit their target. Then you also look at the fact that Taiwan has missile defense, just like Japan has missile defense. So those numbers go way down when you actually look at it. And the same thing occurs with the ships, with the airplanes. Airplanes, maybe a couple hundred fighters, maybe 500 fighters, but Taiwan has 300 fighter aircraft, and they can shoot down PLA aircraft, land, reload, take off, and do the same thing over again. So it's not always a one-to-one ratio that people need to think about. You also think about what's the motivation. If you're a pilot protecting your homeland, you're going to fight a lot harder than somebody who's trying to occupy a land that was never part of the CCP.